Can you imagine hiring a minister who had very few words to say? So that was the first minister of this congregation. Well, this is a bit of a history moment because it comes from the earliest gospel that we know that was used by the other three gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John. This is from the Gospel of Mark. By the time we get in this part of the story, Jesus has been healing and teaching in a kind of scary area for his people. This was in what was perhaps the Gentile area, you might say. And so from there, he left the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, which the area was called the Decapolis, which was 10 cities. And they brought a man to him who was deaf and had an impediment in his speech. And they begged Jesus to lay hands on him. And so Jesus took him aside, away from the crowd, and he put his fingers in his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. And he looked up into the heavens and said, and sighed and said, "Be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, and his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Well, but then Jesus said, now don't tell anyone about this. But the more he said that and admonished them not to tell, the more excited they got and began to freely proclaim him. For they were just astounded. And they said, look, he is doing everything well. He is able to make the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. And that's a story of ears being opened from the Gospel of Mark. Thanks be to God. I got my first taste of jazz at Billy and Bobby Bradley's house. They lived just down the street from me on Hamilton Avenue in Colonial Heights, Virginia. Billy and Bobby were stricken with muscular dystrophy when they were very young boys. And now that they were in their teen years, they were confined to their wheelchairs. But boy, did they know music. They spent most of their days sitting in their living room listening. There were shelves on 3 sides stacked with records. And it was amazing. They seemed to know where each record was in those stacks, and they would tell their dad or their mom who they wanted to listen to and where it was in that vast library of music, hundreds and thousands maybe of records taking up the space in the living room. And up front, where the fireplace usually is, was a state-of-the-art sound system. Now, when they weren't listening, they were playing. In another room were all the instruments. There were electric guitars, and there was a bass, and there was a small drum kit. They still had use of their fingers and arms, and they had a band. They could play any of those, between them, any of those instruments. And so they agreed to give me guitar lessons. And I would go down the street after school, and I would take my second-hand nylon string Yamaha guitar, and they would teach me how to play it. Well, one day I showed up early for my lesson, and I caught them listening. Billy and Bobby were sitting in the living room, and some sounds were coming from the speakers. It sounded a lot like music, but I wasn't sure. It certainly didn't sound like any of the music I heard in church, or even the music I heard on my favorite radio stations. There was a melody in there somewhere, but the notes were stretched out so far I thought they would break. So the band would play together on the record, and then one instrument, like the trumpet maybe, would take over, and it would play for a while, and then there was applause even on the record, and the bass would play, and then there'd be applause, and then the drum. It seemed like that song would go on forever. Finally, the band came back together, and it was as if they got a fresh surge of energy. Throughout, Billy and Bobby were bobbing their heads and fingers tapping on their wheelchair, listening with their eyes closed. Finally, I just said, "What is that?" "What is what?" That music. "Oh," Billy shouted back, "it's jazz." "What's jazz?" Now pause in the story for a minute. When Fats Waller was asked that same question, he says, "Man, if you have to ask, you'll never know." Well, Bobby just said, "Just listen." And I did, and I realized that my guitar lesson was going to have to take a second chair to whatever lesson I was being forced into now. So as it played, I began to grab the album covers that they were listening to, and I started to read to try to get some language about what it was I was listening to. And one reviewer wrote, "Suspended chords, sevenths, ninths, 11ths, 13ths, capture the emotional range of this music. They deal honestly with human experience." honestly with human experience. And then there were some quotes from the artists, like the drummer Art Blakely, who said, "When I play, I'm shaking the dust off my life." And another said, "Life is fragile, but the music says we have what it takes to do what is right." And another said, "I just sing out my feelings." My teenage self was just overwhelmed. Guys, I just don't get it. And I confessed, well, I'm not sure I like it. Bobby said, "Oh, don't worry about it. It's just God messing with your ears." They both laughed. Now, God messing with me was something I did understand. So, is that what jazz is? God messing with my ears? Why? What's God trying to tell us through something like jazz? Well, for one thing, the power that draws people to jazz is improvisation. That is the way that the unpredictable plays off the predictable, and order and disorder playing off of each other, and the irregular plays off the regular. And it kind of like I spent my whole life with the Bible. I've looked at it carefully, critically, even playfully, and took the risk of putting it in the crucible of my experience and in the experiences of others. I take the Bible too seriously to take it literally. And I've come to see the Bible as a story of God's improvisations around the steady beat of God's love for humanity. It's because of that love that Christian faith teaches that God fully entered humanity in the person of Jesus. And it turns out that Jesus is a pretty good improviser himself. Take this story I just told from the Gospel of Mark. An ensemble of friends comes with a man who is deaf, has a speech impairment, and we don't know much about their motive. Were they, like some other of Jesus's opponents, testing him? Well, or were they just a group of friends that were concerned about their friend? Well, we don't really know about their motive, but we know what the situation was for a person who had an impairment in Jesus's world, in a world of this story. They were seen as less than. They were placed off in the margins where the quality of human life was diminished. And you know, the great Louis Armstrong sang for such people, "Any time or place, nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Nobody knows like Jesus. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. Glory, hallelujah." Boy, the jazz musician knows how to explore the trouble in the heart, the soul of humanity. And out of the dissonance between human dreams and sorrow comes an experience of hope. It ain't all that bad. That's the miracle of jazz. Like the miracle in this story. To bring hope out of the dissonance in this man's life, Jesus begins to improvise. He starts messing with his ears. Takes him aside, away from the crowd, puts his fingers in his ears. He spits and touches his tongue and sighs and sings out, "Be opened." And the man's hearing and speech are restored. And so I thought, you know, what this scene really needs is a soundtrack. I mean, the drummer taking the brushes and brushing on the cymbals. capture the suspense of the crowd. What's going to happen? Then the bass player steps over and accompanies Jesus as he brings the man aside. And as he puts his fingers in his ears and he spits on his tongue, the trumpeter, who's also called the preacher, clears out his mouthpiece and plays that high moment, "Be opened." Well, we don't have a soundtrack to jazz up this story, but we do have a jazz factor. Jeremy Bagby is a theologian who plays a mean jazz piano. He says this is what the jazz factor is. The jazz factor is the spontaneous element in the world and in human life that reaches fullness in the unforced, unpredictable creativity of Jesus the Christ. When I went down to the Bradley boys and to their home in my youth so long ago, I thought that they'd be teaching my fingers how to give shape to some new sounds, new chords. I didn't know they'd be the ones to open my ears. I certainly didn't know I'd be hearing a new faith language, a musical language that God would sing, a language with roots in the work songs of enslaved Africans, a language with roots in the spirituals of the Black church, a language that came moaning and posturing out of the Delta and found its way to places like Chicago, walking up and down State Street. It's God's grace language. God uses that language to work out human freedom. It's America's gift of doxology to the world, and it's called jazz.